year, asylum seekers have been terrorizing people here. So, the kind of pushback from the politics in our political capital, The Hague, has been, we need to evenly spread all these people around the Netherlands because Ter Apel cannot really stand this anymore. It doesn't matter if a community doesn't want it, doesn't matter how right-wing you vote in your local elections, doesn't matter what the mayor wants, it all doesn't matter because in the end, typically if the federal government wants to put asylum seekers in your village or in your town or in your city, they will do it.
Spahn did the thing that he went with his husband because it was not allowed in Germany to in the US to pay a woman to carry out his or their child, and this was met with complete outrage in Germany also because Spahn was just like, yeah, well, I didn't broke the law, but here's my child anyway. And people were like very upset about this communication. And this is the second problem, that Spahn was just arrogant and he thought that he's above the law.
So hello and welcome back to the MCC Brussels podcast. This week, a slightly different look. A number of us are traveling, but we got lots of content packed in. We're going to take a look at the Netherlands, where there's plans to force asylum seekers into local areas where the residents really don't want them. We're going to go to Germany, and there's a shocking case of a major figure in the CDU who's been forced to resign over a surrogacy scandal. And then we're going to take a look at Trump's plans for free speech, specifically the desire for a new UN declaration on freedom of speech. Joining us this week on the podcast, really delighted to welcome first time to the podcast, Daniel de Liever from the brilliant website NieuwRechts, which you'll know if you're remotely in the Dutch language. But for those of you who are not, I do urge you to go and check it out. But Daniel de Liever, welcome.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, we're delighted. You see, he's very on brand within his brilliant podcast studio. And joining us also down the line, we've got our colleague, regular guest, Richard Schenk.
It's a pleasure this time. It's greatly not from Brussels because it's summertime.
Indeed. Well, coming first on the things, and very lucky that we've got Daniel on the podcast this week because this is a really interesting and important story. Many people who are on social media will have seen quite a large number of occasionally quite aggressive protests in the Netherlands against asylum hotels in the Netherlands, a kind of a local concentration of asylum seekers, and a great number of residents have taken to the streets to demand that they're not housed in this way. And it's had an impact on local politics, but the latest from the central government has been basically you're going to have to put up with this and everybody needs to shut up about it. Daniel, could you explain what's been going on with these asylum kind of centers that are cropping up in various parts of the Netherlands, the response to it, the kind of popular pushback, and what the central government's done? Can you talk us through it?
Of course, let me first start by explaining a little bit what's happening. We have like a central asylum center in a village called Ter Apel in the northern part of the Netherlands. And for years, asylum seekers have been terrorizing people here. So, the kind of pushback from the politics in our political capital, The Hague, has been, we need to evenly spread all these people around the Netherlands because Ter Apel cannot really stand this anymore. So you got the infamous law called the spreidingswet, where we have to spread all the asylum seekers throughout the country. It doesn't matter if a community doesn't want it. It doesn't matter how right-wing you vote in your local elections. Doesn't matter what your mayor wants, it all doesn't matter because in the end, typically if the federal government wants to put asylum seekers in your village or in your town or in your city, they will do it. And we had at the last elections, at the local elections, we had a lot more local right-wing parties and national right-wing parties being voted in with the promise they will not get more asylum seekers. But they cannot really have this promise being secured now that we see that they're actually trying to refuse it. There are more and more demonstrations all across the country. And we see that the national government, the most progressive we have ever had, is now saying, if in the next few weeks to months you're not going to step in, we're going to force it down your throat, we're going to decide where it is, how many, and it's bringing a lot of tension to our country.
Yeah, but brilliantly explained, and thanks for that, Daniel. Richard, in a way, this is a story that we see writ large right across Europe, which is that no matter what people vote for at a local or a national level, the answer always seems to be the same: more migration, more asylum seekers. What's your take on this story?
Yeah, and obviously, if you're against that in your local community, then you're immediately branded as proto-fascist, right-wing extremists, whatever, even though we see that in many communities, this is quite, once the people actually have the real impression of migrants that is not filtered through media, but is shaped through everyday life, living together in the shared space. This leads to some good results. People sometimes assimilate, they become productive parts, but often enough, the reality does not match the rosé picture that was painted by the media. And then so, for example, in my area, in Germany, where my family lived, we had also a big asylum seeker home, and the government obviously promised that this will be only families with children. Obviously, they weren't. So this and in the last elections, then an area that used to be not that favorable for AfD suddenly voted 40%. The polling station voted 40% in favor of the AfD. So we see that this that migration, as people perceive it in their day-to-day lives, is much more realistic than it is by the governments. But I mean, what should they do? I mean, concentrating the asylum seekers in just to a small village like Ter Apel was also a recipe for disaster. I mean, the obvious solution to that is not let these people into this country in this amount of numbers, and to get out the people who already have deportation orders that have been confirmed by courts. There's hundreds of thousands of people in many countries that people who should leave the country immediately and should not be spread out the country. And I think the Dutch debate is in this regard a bit like behind, because the Spreidingswet is quite a recent phenomenon, while in other European countries they have already done this. So in Germany it is called the Königstein Key, how to distribute the migrants across the federal states, and then the federal states divide how they approach it. But usually it's then the local municipality who is then overburdened by taking care of these migrants. It means a lot of burden for the local government, schools, teachers, police, etc.
Yeah, I'm reminded of the similar debate that's taking place in the UK at the moment, where in response to widespread concerns about the migrant hotels, as they're known in the UK, they're looking to spread them out into private houses across the country by renting private houses out and putting the migrants there, which means that for all of the problems of the migrant hotels, you can now be living next door to a large house full of 10 or 12 new migrants in your local area. But Daniel, what's the kind of? Can you give us a sense of the mood on the street in these local areas? Because it seems like this is quite, as I said in my introduction, there've been some protests. I don't know if in quite the same areas as the ones you've raised, but it seems like this is one of those issues where the government is pushing people further and further, and the reaction is potentially getting more and more significant.
Yes, let me start with an example. We had like a lot of tension going on, and I think people are very much fed up with what's happening. People see that all of the so-called centrist parties who are pushing the mass migration for decades at this point, that they keep promising that they will turn down the amount of immigrants coming in, but it doesn't happen. And therefore people are very angry. And the perfect example of this is the village called Loosdrecht. Continuously, every single day, we had demonstrations. It even turned into, fights with the police, and it even turned into the fire being turned on at the Asylum Center accidentally with fireworks a few weeks ago. So the tension is increasing. And what do you see happening? Especially the politicians, the left-wing ones, are using this to say that these are far-right people, that their worries are not actually realistic. Once asylum seekers, it's all good. And we see that this is not happening. We see every day that more and more violence is happening. More people are becoming desperate. And a lot of people are losing the trust in democracy and the rule of law being applied equally and for their safety to be guaranteed. And I think this is the biggest problem that people have. A lot of Dutch people are quite tolerant. I think on average they are very tolerant people. We have a big history of having immigrants, mostly European ones, of course, so it is a little bit different. But this history has made the Dutch people who are quite liberal, I guess, compared to other people, quite open to helping immigrants. But even their patience is now done. They see that their sons and daughters are not as safe anymore in the streets. And they really see that there's a time to really have more radical solutions to what's happening now. And I think this is going to be the clash of the next few years in the Netherlands.
Yeah, indeed. And Richard, again, this sense that we see spreading out right across Europe, that there's a kind of increasing almost lack of faith in the democratic process itself, because people see that they try over and over again to have their voices heard, and the response of the mainstream, as you said, is to just brand them as far right fascists or something. But the flip side of that is that people see time and again that their votes are effectively being ignored.
I mean, in the migration debate, we are not even talking about local governments who are in charge. It's not even the national ones. We have such a tight international legal framework from the Geneva Convention and EU laws that the national governments are basically forced by the European Union to open up their borders. So we have the Hungary is the most prominent case. So Viktor Orban's permanent fight on migration against Brussels was legendary for almost 10 years, and then it ended in some European court decisions that Hungary's procedure that asylum applications have to be first filed in an embassy abroad, an Hungarian embassy abroad, that this violated EU law. So this is an obvious example how EU law is restricting the national government's movement. And then obviously, as Daniel said, we have a lot of national political parties who were naive till very much complacent in this regard. They're mostly from the political center. Honestly, I don't blame the lefties on this issue. This is what they call policy and promise all the way along. They just did what they could. They delivered on their promises. The big problem was in the political center, that these parties were naive about the economic impact of migration, about the impact on security issues, and how much people just hate to be an object of societal engineering, of so-called transformation, while they just want to live in peace.
Yeah, indeed. And whilst we've seen some positive moves at the EU level under the pressure of the right parties, genuinely right-wing parties, it's still very clear that on the migration issue, there's a long, long way to go, both in dismantling that international infrastructure that you talked about, Richard, and then also the very tricky question of what are we going to do once we have reclaimed control of our borders, and yet there are many millions of people across Europe who have no right to be here, and these questions are certainly going to come to the fore in the coming years, and we'll definitely be a part of that as MCC Brussels. Okay, moving on now. Another story that's been in the news this week is a very interesting one. We've always had an interest in the topics of the various parenthood debates and surrogacy. And here in Germany, major scandals broken out where a major politician in the CSU has been forced to resign after it came to light that he used an American surrogacy service so that him and his husband could acquire a child through surrogacy. It was saying that it's not what he's done is illegal technically in Germany, but it's still a very fraught question given that Germany has a very specific surrogacy policies, and these issues are very much in the minds of voters in Germany and elsewhere.
Well, it was controversial for two reasons. First, the surrogacy motherhood in Germany is basically forbidden. There are almost no exceptions to this rule. And it's quite, and in the majority of European countries, it is also forbidden. Then there are some countries who don't allow it actively, but only a very few countries allow it for sick people or for medical reasons or and very seldomly for same-sex marriages. So our international audience has to understand that in Europe, the public is mostly against this, and this is an issue that is over left and right divide in many cases. Spahn did the thing that he went with his husband because it was not allowed in Germany in the US to pay a woman to carry out his or their child. And this was met with complete outrage in Germany, also because Spahn was just like, yeah, well, I didn't broke the law, but somehow here's my child anyway. And people were like very upset about this communication. And this is the second problem, that Spahn was just arrogant, and he thought that he's above the law. And this resonated very much with the electorate that was already very much upset with the German political elite. Namely, number one is Chancellor Friedrich Merz, who has terrible popularity rankings because he's perceived as arrogant, as detached from reality. And now his second in command did the same. So this really damaged the government politician's reputation. and has caused a huge problem for Friedrich Merz that he had to deal with during the summer break.
Yeah, and Daniel, I mean, the whole surrogacy issue is, of course, very controversial right across Europe, and people are entitled to their different opinions on it. But it is kind of indicative here that you have very much a member of Germany's elite class seeming to have what to ordinary people seems very, very odd or strange value system. And the fact that it can be kind of, as Richard indicated, the response to this is not even to understand that many people might consider that what he's done is out of step with the broad morality of the country. What was your take on the story?
Yes, I think what's interesting about this story, and sadly about many of what we see with the elites in Europe doing, is that they're very much attached from the countries they're living in. You have the saying of the somewheres and the anywheres, and I think what's different now with the elites from, let's say, days back, is that back in the day, the elites, even though they would have their own thing they would be doing, they would be rooted in the local place they would be living, and they would be more sensitive to the morale and the importance of the local traditions that were happening. But we see now this is not the case anymore. We see the complete detachment from the elites, like in this case, that where they have no sensitivity, even though they're from a Christian Democratic Party, which used to be quite conservative and used to have a big understanding of what you would say a big part of Germany in this case would understand. And we see that they are not even aware anymore of the hypocrisy of this, that you have quite strict rules in Germany and that there's a workaround, which you can only do if you have a lot of money. And that's the only way that they can do that, by moving away from the German borders to America. And we've seen this happening over and over with many different controversial topics. For me, that is a sign of this time, and also the crisis we have with our elites, is that if even the Christian Democratic Party in Germany, if they don't have the sensitivity that one of their top politicians has actually to be kind of sensitive to how people think about this, then it's not surprising that a lot of the important issues of these times are not really understood by our elites.
Indeed, yes. I mean, just on the face of it, it doesn't seem to be a particularly strongly Christian kind of policy for the Christian Democrat parliamentary leader to be pursuing. And also, as you say, when the response people is just to go abroad, use their international mobility to, as it were, circumvent the rules of their own country, it doesn't seem very democratic either. But Richard, I mean, this is, I mean, as I said, the surrogacy issue is very, very big. But one of the things that we've been following closely is the EU's attempt to, as it were, provide a EU-wide legal basis for surrogacy, and indeed change what many would consider to be slightly unique approaches that people might have to parenthood through what's called the Parenthood certificate, which is essentially a way to force various member states to accept the novel family arrangements that might be common among the highly mobile international class. Can you tell us a bit about what the Parenthood certificate means and why it might be significant in this case?
Yeah, so what Spahn did is supposed to be the role model for the next time in Europe. If you follow the LGBTQ plus lobby in Brussels, they are pushing very hard for a so-called parenthood certificate. This means that if one country in the European Union does not allow for surrogate motherhood, you should be just able to go to another country, do it there, and then your home country has to accept the birth certificate of the child as it was issued by the other country. Obviously, this is designed to circumvent the opposition to surrogate motherhood in the majority of Europe. So even one European Union member state would be enough in future to basically hollow out the entire anti-surrogacy legislation. And previously, I mentioned that it is surrogacy is an issue that is that is somehow uniting the right and the left, because obviously you have conservative people who are in this regard against surrogacy. You have law and order people who are upset about this concept, but also you have feminists on the left side who see surrogacy as some kind of slavery for women. I mean, this language, still slavery, was even introduced by a European Parliament decision. And because of that, the LGBTQ lobby knows that they will never win the public debate. What they are doing instead is strategic litigation. So they are using lawfare against the current legal order to hollow it out. There were several cases, Baby Sarah and other ones, that have basically paved the way that member states now have to. There's almost no reason for a member state in the European Union to not acknowledge a birth certificate from another one. And by this way, they have completely shaped the public debate around. So they completely bypass democratic majorities in the member states, or even in Europe as a whole. This is an absolute masterpiece how European Union decision making should not work. Thank God there is still some opposition in the European Union Council, because the national governments know, for example, how much legal trouble this surrogacy motherhood would cause, because inheritance, family law, taking care of the children. So this is all would open up the Pandora's box on national legal systems, and people don't want to do that. There is no reason. It's only a very small minority of people who are pushing this, and we have to resist and call out these attempts and push especially the European Union and also the European Court of Justice to not give in to this small lobby, which is very vocal solely in Brussels.
Yeah, and Daniel, I think it's very much of a piece with your previous comment that when you see that this, there's a word, kind of disconnected elite class that's highly international, highly mobile internationally, they converge on an idea that is wildly out of step with the general populations across Europe, but it finds enormous institutional support both in EU and legal institutions.
That's true for sure. And I think this has to do also with that these elites, they are not just trying to do this through undemocratic ways, they also have their own ideology in general, which is very globalist, which is anti-borders. And that's, if you look at this whole LGBTQ lobby that you see, that is aligning itself, of course, with a lot of the globalist elites. The difference between men and women, it's not really on a biological level either. Is not really accepted anymore. We see that the borders between countries, which we saw it when we talked about mass migration, is, not really being accepted. And so there are more of these issues where they're trying to push it through, even though it's against the common sense of normal people. Normal people, they really realize that there are borders. They see it within their own families, within their own relationships, with their own communities, with their own countries. So the only way that you can force this through is with lawfare. And that's what we see happening with many of these issues, including surrogacy. And like Richard says, it is a Pandora's box. And I'm afraid a lot of the resistance in the countries themselves are not aware of what's happening. And I think that is what the EU is doing. They try with this lawfare to strategically do it in countries and in places where it's weakened, where there's distracted because of other important issues going on. And these NGOs are aware of this. And we had a lot of reports leaking what's been happening also what you guys do at MCC Brussels in the way they're trying to strategically litigate this. And if they continue to do this, they have the patience, they have the tax money from all of us to keep doing this endlessly until they find a victory somewhere. And if they do, they will try to push it through the EU legislation somewhere else. And I think that's what we're up against. And no matter where you stand exactly on these issues, the fact how this is going is very problematic, as we see with many issues. And that's where I think we need to look more at how this is funded through the NGOs if we really want to stop this.
Yes, indeed. I mean, we do have a report that looks at some of these issues, the use of lawfare and the reforms of the education system. But that point about the way in which they almost shop around the EU countries, trying to find the most hospitable place in order to push the agenda forward, kind of one step at a time, is very much how this works. And people should really be a lot wiser about that, and also understanding that it only takes to get the foot in the door in one EU country, and then potentially the whole thing can be kind of rolled out right across the European Union. So finally this week, back to Donald Trump. We haven't mentioned Donald Trump on the podcast, I think, for a few weeks, which was either a relief to some of our viewers or an omission, depending on where you stand. But the latest news is a big free speech case. Donald Trump wants to take the issue of free speech right to the United Nations, and the United States are pushing a declaration on free speech that is widely interpreted as being very squarely aimed against many European countries and the European Union as a whole. They want a UN-wide declaration that restrictions on freedom of speech should only really be justified when there's an imminent threat of violence, basically applying the same legal framework that exists in America. They would like an international kind of declaration or approach on this. Richard, I mean, we're huge advocates of freedom of speech here at MCC Brussels, but we've also had our fair share of being critical of attempts to resolve these issues through multinational institutions like the UN. So what's your take on this issue, and is it really right that Trump tries to push this thing through the UN, or are these arguments that we need to win at home?
Well, I mean, it's a UN General Assembly resolution. It has no legal binding power, so it's not going to impose more restrictions on the UN member states. UN, but it nevertheless it has a political signal, and I think we cannot also just let the UN be a lefty playground for the issue. So it's very good that we have for once an important decision in the UN General Assembly. And if really this goes through, this would highlight by far how much the European Union, which is supposed to be a leader on values across the world that are supposed to be imitated, is actually detached from the global developments. And that's the complete opposite that used to be, that Brussels used to be the leading the way regarding regulation. Because in Europe, we have a very specific coalition of far left activists who are pushing because of woke policies, identity policy reasons, for the restriction of freedom of speech. They call everything hate speech and fascism that is not matching their opinions. But this resonates very well, and this is the most dangerous aspect with the European bureaucratic elites and ailing center parties in Europe, which are under constant pressure. They are losing election after election. They feel that their power is slipping through their hands, and they diagnosis, dangerously enough, is that they don't have enough control over the public sphere. They think that really it's Russia or it's some far-right networks of whoever are controlling the media, and this is the reason why they are failing at the elections, and not because they are putting forward policies that are basically not resonating with the electorate. So they are really determined to push forward a crackdown on free speech using all means on every level, from national to EU and above. At EU level, we see that they want to tighten their copyright laws. They have this huge, insane program called the Democracy Shield, which is a shield against democracy, which is a shopping list for all these authoritarian measures. At national level, we have seen that they are buying up, for example, media. The government is now directly subsidizing media in Germany, so that's a whole package, and we should be really thankful that the motion is put forward to call this out.
Yeah, indeed. Well, the problem, the fundamental problem of the crackdown on freedom of expression in Europe is, I mean, we've been pushing that since day one at MCC Brussels. Yeah, I still have a little bit of residual concern about pushing these things internationally that Richard hasn't entirely disabused me of. Daniel, what's your take on this? Should we be? Is this? Do we support this declaration at the UN, or do we do so with reservation?
It's a good question. I would say both. I would agree with Richard that while we have these institutions and while they are politically active, we need to push back. And I think it's time for people with common sense to wake up and realize that, if a lot of the decisions are being made in these globalist networks, then yes, on the one hand, we can ask ourselves, how can we get back our national sovereignty? But on the other hand, while this still exists, we need to push them into a way that actually doesn't undermine this process. And I think that's where it's interesting what Trump is doing. In general, I agree that it's problematic that we're going to use the EU, the UN, to talk about the freedom of speech in Europe. But all the other things that we're doing so far have not been massively successful. So I would say maybe this can be one of the many steps where we can call the bluff of the European Union, because what they constantly do, for example, also indeed what was mentioned with the Democracy Shield, they use this beautiful language. You could say it's Orwellian truth speak that they're using here to shield themselves from actually being honest about what their goals are, because indeed they are feeling threatened, and especially as the digital world is becoming more and more prominent in our daily lives, but also in political lives, we see that the crackdown, for example, with the Digital Services Act on the digital spaces and on the huge social media platforms, especially those like X that have more freedom of speech also for other voices, are being pushed away by the European Union. So I think we need more even at this point, because the problem is so huge, than our national countries to actually fight it. Without freedom of speech, it's hardly possible to have any resistance to a lot of the problems we have in the European Union. So at that point, that is existential. And I would say, I don't think Trump is only doing it out of the kindness of his heart. We should be realistic there, but we can use it also to our advantage in a political game that we have to play.
Yeah, indeed. And directly on that, Richard, one of the things that I find interesting is the way in which any criticisms related to freedom of speech that come from the Trump administration or MAGA figures are immediately just kind of bracketed by the EU elite as, oh, this is only just to do with the fact that they want their technology companies to not have to, in the EU phrase, play by the rules. I think it's important. Of course, there are the interests of large American technology companies, and we shouldn't be naive about that. But I think it's very important to push back on this narrative that any attempt to defend freedom of speech is simply somehow some kind of American import.
Well, I mean, the big losers of this are, for example, alternative media, new media that are innovators regarding media. For example, in Germany, we had this case from Ben's podcast, who interviewed Bernd Höcke from the AfD, and this caused a huge outcry. And immediately he received a letter from the media regulator in his state that he should answer how he dared to do this. And I mean, he could afford this because he was a comparatively successful YouTuber, but other ones who have creative ideas but are still at the beginning might be self-censoring from nowadays because they cannot afford to a legal fight. And this is how it works. In the digital age, it works subtle, so you don't see it. It's not like in the analog age where they were actually just tearing apart printing presses of unwanted newspapers. You see that content is muted down, and you see that there is civil and sometimes even criminal law pressure on the content creators. And in this regard, we have, I think, a dispersed but still huge public in Europe who is itself interested in having a healthy media landscape, not to mention the general public who has the right to a healthy media landscape to form their political opinions. And it's actually quite sad that it needed Elon Musk, for example, to call this out. We should have our own European voices, and we should be very vocal about this and defend our rights here in Europe ourselves.
Yeah, well, that's certainly one of the ironies of it is that the enormous regulatory kind of landscape that the EU has assembled has actually meant that only the large American technology companies are even capable of competing here, because some potential European kind of challenger company simply would be overwhelmed by the compliance costs of dealing with this in enormous regulatory state that the EU's assembled. And that's why it's also is bigger than just speech, because this is also a significant economic problem as well, isn't it, Daniel? It's not that we care 100% about speech, but also all of the lack of economic dynamism is in large part also traceable to this enormous series of regulations that technology companies are forced to follow.
Yes, that's a very good point, I would say. Indeed, the irony of what's happening is that we constantly see that the European economy as a whole is doing quite badly, and we see especially left-wing economic ideas being dominant in the political elites. And the way it works is quite simple. The way they think is, we need to have a bigger government so we can plan the economy better, which doesn't work. So then you have worse economic results. What do? They regulate more. They try to increase the taxes more, so they have more spending power to regulate the economy, which creates this kind of trap that we're seeing now, where a lot of wealthy people and young talented people are leaving Europe, which creates even more of a debt trap, where you see that a smaller group of capable people have to pay for the debt, have to pay for the regulatory problems that we see in Europe. And the irony of it all is that at the same time, they're saying, we need to do this and need to protect ourselves. But in the end, a lot of the industries that they are promoting, let's say like the climate policies that are happening, and the industry behind it, but also the immigration policies and the industry behind it, billions and billions of euros. So we see a lot of the money being flown to these specific things over the back of normal European people, and that creates a lot of tension. It's, I think, the thing we are seeing now. And the last point I would want to make there, which brings it back to the freedom of speech, why I still think it's very important, with the digital technology, the amount of censorship you is something that, was not even possible in the DDR. If you look at how many people at that time were needed to actually have a functioning state that could actually censorship a lot of people, you needed thousands and thousands of people. We see now that countries like China are promoting, this kind of censorship model to the rest of the world, where you can buy it even from them. Have like a relatively cheap way to have mass surveillance of people. So I do think it's also very important to realize what's at stake here and what's possible in this day and age.
Yeah, a very important point, Daniel, and something we're dead worried about here at MCC Brussels, and there's free speech, as all of our viewers know, is a very core part of what we do. But that's what we've got time for on the MCC Brussels podcast this week. If you've enjoyed this episode, please, as ever, share it with your friends. Leave us a comment on YouTube, like and subscribe on the YouTube channel or on X, wherever you might be watching this. If you've enjoyed this slightly New York podcast, we might be doing a few more of these down the line as some of us are traveling over the summer. So let us know if you enjoyed this slightly different take on the MCC Brussels podcast. But for now, I'd like to thank our guests, especially Daniel de Liever from NieuwRechts. Again, go and check out the brilliant work that he's doing there. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Daniel. And Richard, thanks a lot for joining us once more.
Thanks for staying with us over the summer.
We'll see you next week at the same time on the MCC Brussels podcast.